You have given your life to someone who promised you forever, only to discover that forever was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion designed to keep you small, controllable, grateful for crumbs while he feasted on entire banquets you knew nothing about. You have stood by his side through every storm, believing that loyalty would be rewarded, that sacrifice would be seen, that love would eventually be enough. But now you sit alone with the ashes of what you thought was your life, holding documents that prove everything you believed was wrong. The man you married, the man you trusted with your dreams, your youth, your very identity, was not who you thought he was. And the worst part, the part that keeps you awake at night, is not the betrayal itself, but the question it forces you to ask. Who was I all along, if not his wife? Today, I am going to share with you a story that will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about marriage, about trust, and about the strength that lives inside a woman who has been pushed to her absolute breaking point. This is the story of a woman who discovered that her husband's death was not an ending, but a beginning. The moment when all his secrets came spilling out like water from a broken dam, and what she found when she finally decided to stop being the woman he wanted her to be. I am Patricia, I am 67 years old, and 3 weeks ago I buried my husband of 42 years without shedding a single tear. Because by the time they lowered his coffin into that expensive plot in the prestigious cemetery he had chosen for himself, I had already learned enough to know that the man I thought I knew had never really existed at all. My name is Patricia Ann Morrison, and for 4 decades I was known simply as Richard Morrison's wife, a title I wore with pride, with devotion, with the kind of blind loyalty that now makes me want to laugh and cry at the same time. I was the woman who hosted his dinner parties, who smiled at his business associates, who pretended not to notice when he came home late smelling of perfume that was not mine, who told myself that a good wife does not ask questions, does not make demands, does not rock the boat that keeps her comfortable and dry. I was raised to believe that marriage was a sacred contract, that a woman's job was to support her husband, to make his life easier, to be grateful for the roof over her head and the food on her table. And I was grateful, I truly was, because Richard gave me a beautiful home in suburban Connecticut, 2 children who grew up with every advantage, vacations in Europe and the Caribbean, a closet full of designer clothes, and a jewelry box that sparkled with diamonds and pearls. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined in my wildest nightmares, was that every single gift, every luxury, every moment of comfort was paid for with money that came from a life I knew nothing about, a shadow existence that my husband maintained for over 30 years while I slept peacefully beside him, believing I knew the man whose breath I could hear in the darkness. The morning Richard died started like any other Saturday in our household. I woke up at 6:30, as I always did, and went downstairs to make coffee, the expensive Ethiopian blend that Richard insisted on having shipped directly from a specialty roaster in New York City. The kitchen was quiet, the early morning light filtering through the sheer curtains I had chosen 15 years ago and never thought to replace. I remember standing at the counter waiting for the coffee to brew, thinking about what I would make for breakfast, whether Richard would want his usual eggs and toast or if he might be in the mood for pancakes. These were the thoughts that occupied my mind, the small domestic calculations that had become the rhythm of my existence. I heard him come down the stairs, his footsteps heavier than usual, and when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the house. I asked him if he was feeling all right, and he waved his hand dismissively, the way he always did when I expressed concern, as if my worry was an inconvenience rather than an expression of love. He sat down at the breakfast table and picked up the newspaper, and I turned back to the coffee maker, thinking that he was probably just tired, that he had been working too hard lately, that I would suggest he take a day off, maybe go golfing with his friends, do something relaxing. I was pouring his coffee when I heard the sound, a strange gurgling noise that made me turn around, and I saw him clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain, the newspaper falling from his hands like a bird shot from the sky. I dropped the coffee pot and it shattered on the floor, sending hot liquid splashing across my bare feet, but I barely felt it as I rushed to his side, calling his name, asking him what was wrong. What should I do? Should I call an ambulance? He looked at me then, and I will never forget the expression on his face, a mixture of fear and something else, something I did not recognize at the time but now understand was regret. The terrible regret of a man who knows he is about to die with secrets still buried deep inside him. He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my skin, and he said words that made no sense to me then, but have haunted every moment of my life since. He said, "The farm, Patricia. You have to go to the farm." And then his grip loosened and his eyes rolled back and he slumped forward onto the table, and I was screaming for help that would not arrive in time, screaming for the paramedics who would pronounce him dead on arrival, screaming for the life that was ending not just for him, but for me as well, though I did not know it yet. The funeral was a grand affair. Exactly the kind of spectacle Richard would have wanted, with hundreds of mourners filling the church where we had been married so many decades ago, where our children had been baptized, where I had sat every Sunday morning listening to sermons about faith and duty and the sacred bonds of matrimony. I sat in the front pew in my black Chanel dress, accepting condolences from people whose names I barely remembered, watching as business associates and golf buddies and neighbors spoke about what a wonderful man my husband had been, what a pillar of the community, what a devoted family man. My daughter Jennifer sat beside me, her hand occasionally reaching over to squeeze mine, her face properly somber, but her eyes already calculating, I could tell, already thinking about the will, the inheritance, the distribution of assets that would soon make her and her brother very wealthy people. My son Thomas was on my other side, his wife keeping their 2 children quiet in the pew behind us, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I felt nothing, absolutely nothing, as they spoke about the man I had shared my life with for 42 years. I had cried when my mother died, had sobbed uncontrollably when my father followed her 2 years later, had wept for friends lost to illness and age. But sitting there in that church, surrounded by flowers and grief and the heavy scent of incense, I could not summon a single tear for the man who had been my husband, and I wondered if there was something wrong with me, if shock had frozen my emotions, if the tears would come later, when I was alone in our empty house with only memories for company. It was 3 days after the funeral when I found the key. I was going through Richard's things, a task I had been dreading but knew I could not postpone forever, when I discovered a small compartment hidden in the back of his desk drawer. The desk was an antique he had bought at an auction years ago, a massive mahogany piece that dominated his home office, and I had always assumed I knew every inch of it because I was the one who dusted it every week, who polished the wood until it gleamed, who arranged his papers and pens, with the careful attention of a woman who took pride in maintaining an orderly home. But I had never noticed the slight inconsistency in the drawer's depth, had never thought to press the panel at the back that slid aside to reveal a space no larger than a pack of cards. Inside was a single key, old-fashioned and brass, attached to a leather keychain with the initials RM stamped into the surface. I held it in my palm, feeling its weight, trying to understand what it could possibly unlock. And that was when Richard's last words came back to me with the force of a physical blow. "The farm, Patricia, you have to go to the farm." We did not have a farm. In all our years of marriage, Richard had never mentioned owning any property beyond our house and the vacation condo in Florida we bought when the children were teenagers. He had never expressed any interest in farming, in rural life, in anything that could not be found within the comfortable boundaries of our upper-middle-class existence. And yet his dying words, the very last thing he chose to say to me in this world, were about a farm I knew nothing about. I sat at his desk for a long time, turning the key over and over in my hands, feeling something stir inside me that I had not felt in years, perhaps decades. It was curiosity, yes, but it was also something else, something that felt dangerous and exciting and absolutely necessary. It was the beginning of my awakening, though I did not know it then, the first moment when I started to become someone other than Richard Morrison's wife. If this story resonates with you, if you have felt the particular pain of realizing that the life you built was constructed on foundations of lies, you are not alone. This channel exists for people like us, people who have been betrayed by those who promised to love and protect us, people who are searching for the strength to rebuild when everything they believed has crumbled to dust. Subscribe so we can continue this journey together, finding our voices, sharing our stories, reminding each other that we are worthy of truth and dignity. I spent the next week searching through every document I could find, every file cabinet, every box in the attic, every folder on Richard's computer. What I discovered was a paper trail that led to a property I had never heard of, a 300-acre farm in rural Virginia, purchased 34 years ago and held in a trust that bore my husband's name, but had been carefully hidden from every financial statement he had ever shown me. The property was described in the legal documents as agricultural land with multiple structures, and the address meant nothing to me, just a rural route number in a county I could not even locate on a map without help. I found bank statements from an account I did not know existed, showing regular transfers of significant amounts of money, sometimes $10,000 a month, sometimes more, going to this Virginia property for over 3 decades. I found correspondence with lawyers who were not our family attorney, discussing matters related to the farm in language that was deliberately vague, as if they knew someone might someday read these letters and wanted to obscure their true meaning. And I found photographs, a single envelope of photographs hidden at the very bottom of a locked filing cabinet. And when I saw what they contained, I had to sit down because my legs would no longer support me. The photographs showed a house, a beautiful old farmhouse with a wraparound porch and green shutters, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees. They showed gardens bursting with flowers, a red barn in the distance, horses grazing in a fenced pasture. And they showed people, a woman about my age with dark hair and warm brown eyes, and 2 young men who looked to be in their 20s or early 30s, standing on that porch, smiling at the camera, looking for all the world like a happy family posing for a portrait. On the back of one photograph, in handwriting I recognized as my husband's, were written 3 words that changed everything: my other life. I did not tell my children what I had found. I did not tell anyone. For 3 days I walked around in a daze, going through the motions of grief and widowhood, while inside my mind raced with questions I could not answer and suspicions I could not voice. Who was this woman? Who were these young men? How had Richard maintained an entire secret existence for over 30 years without anyone knowing, without me suspecting, without a single slip or mistake that might have revealed the truth? I thought about all the business trips he had taken over the years, the conferences and meetings and client visits that took him away from home for days at a time, sometimes weeks. I thought about the phone calls he would take in his office with the door closed, the times he seemed distracted or preoccupied, the occasions when I would catch him staring out the window with an expression I could not read. I had always attributed these moments to stress, to the pressures of running a successful financial consulting firm, to the weight of responsibility that came with being the sole provider for our family. But now I understood that every one of those moments, every closed door and distant gaze, was a window into a world I was never meant to see, a life that existed in parallel to the one we shared, a family that was not a family at all, but rather a carefully constructed alternative to everything I believed was real. On the 4th day after my discovery, I made a decision. I was going to Virginia. I was going to find this farm, this hidden property that my husband had valued enough to mention with his dying breath. I was going to confront whatever truth awaited me there, no matter how painful, no matter how devastating. I had spent 42 years being a good wife, a supportive partner, a woman who did not ask uncomfortable questions or demand explanations that were not freely offered. I had spent 4 decades living in a beautiful prison of my own making, accepting the bars because they were gilded, because they came with comfort and security and the illusion of love. But Richard was dead now, and whatever power he had held over me, whatever control he had exercised through silence and misdirection, had died with him. I was 67 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, I was going to do exactly what I wanted. Consequences be damned. I packed a small bag, told Jennifer I was going to visit an old friend for a few days, and got in my car with nothing but the address, the key, and a determination that burned in my chest like a fire that had been smothered for far too long. The drive to Virginia took nearly 6 hours, and I spent every mile of it thinking about what I might find when I arrived. I imagined confrontations and confessions, tears and accusations, the kind of dramatic scene you see in movies when secrets are finally revealed. I imagined the woman in the photographs, this mysterious stranger who had apparently shared my husband for longer than I had known she existed. And I tried to summon hatred for her, but found I could not. How could I hate someone I did not know, someone who might be as much a victim of Richard's deceptions as I was? Perhaps she did not know about me. Perhaps she believed she was his only wife, his true partner, the woman he loved best. Perhaps we were both fools, both deceived, both living in illusions that Richard had carefully crafted to serve his own desires. The landscape changed as I drove south, the manicured suburbs of Connecticut giving way to Pennsylvania farmland, then the rolling hills of Maryland, and finally the lush greenery of Virginia, where spring was further advanced and wildflowers bloomed along the roadsides like confetti scattered by an invisible hand. The GPS guided me off the highway and onto increasingly narrow roads, past small towns with names I had never heard, past farms and forests and churches with white steeples pointing toward heaven, until, finally, I turned onto a gravel road that wound through thick woods before opening onto a vista that took my breath away. The farm was more beautiful than the photographs had suggested. It spread across the landscape like something from a dream. 300 acres of rolling pastures and cultivated fields bordered by a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight, and ancient oaks that must have stood there for centuries. At the center of it all sat the farmhouse, exactly as it appeared in the pictures, with its wraparound porch and green shutters, but larger than I had imagined, more substantial, more permanent. There were outbuildings scattered across the property, a red barn that looked recently painted, what appeared to be a guest cottage near the main house, equipment sheds and storage facilities that spoke of a working agricultural operation. Horses grazed in a fenced paddock near the barn, beautiful animals with glossy coats, and I could see chickens scratching in a yard near the house, dogs lounging on the porch, cats stalking through the tall grass. It was idyllic, pastoral, the kind of place featured in magazines about country living, the kind of property that cost millions of dollars and required years of careful attention to maintain. And it belonged to my husband, to the man who had told me for 4 decades that we could not afford a vacation home, that real estate was a bad investment, that we should put our money in stocks and bonds and keep our lives simple. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway, staring at this secret kingdom, feeling something collapse inside me, some final wall of denial that I had been maintaining without even knowing it. This was real. This was true. My husband had lived another life, and that life was laid out before me in all its undeniable beauty. I do not know how long I sat there before she appeared. I was lost in thoughts that spiraled like water down a drain, memories re-examined, conversations reinterpreted, a lifetime of assumptions crumbling under the weight of this new reality. But eventually I noticed movement on the porch, and I looked up to see a woman stepping out of the house, shading her eyes against the sun, looking toward my unfamiliar car with obvious curiosity. Even from this distance, I recognized her from the photographs. She was older now, of course. Her dark hair streaked with gray, her face lined with the years that had passed since those pictures were taken. But there was no mistaking her, no pretending she was anyone other than the woman my husband had called his other life. She started walking toward me, and I realized I had a choice to make. I could drive away, could flee back to Connecticut and pretend I had never come here, could spend the rest of my life wondering but never knowing. Or I could get out of my car, face whatever truth awaited me, and finally, begin to understand who I had really been married to. I chose the second option. I opened my car door, stepped out onto the gravel driveway, and walked toward the woman who had shared my husband for 34 years. Right now you might be feeling exactly what I felt in that moment, that churning mixture of fear and anger and desperate need to understand. That sense that your whole life has been a story told by an unreliable narrator, that every memory you cherished has been revealed as incomplete at best, a deliberate lie at worst. I need to pause here and ask you something directly, something that matters. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was living a double life? Have you ever learned that the foundation of your existence was built on secrets that were kept from you deliberately, systematically for years or even decades? If you are nodding right now, if your chest feels tight because this story is hitting too close to home, I want you to know that your experience matters. When you share your story in the comments, even just a few words, you are helping someone else who is reading this feel less alone in their devastation. You are building the community that we all needed but did not have when our worlds collapsed. So let me see you down there. Type in the comments, "I trusted someone who was living a lie." That is all. Just that sentence. And I promise you, when you read the other comments, when you see how many people write the same words, you will understand that you were never alone in this. You were just silent together. Thank you for having the courage to speak up. Your voice matters here. Her name was Eleanor, and she had been Richard's wife for 31 years. Not his mistress, not his girlfriend, not some temporary arrangement he maintained on the side. His wife, legally married in a ceremony that took place 3 years after our own wedding, in a small chapel in this very county, with witnesses and a preacher and all the trappings of legitimacy. She had a marriage certificate to prove it, documents that bore my husband's signature alongside hers, a legal union that made no sense given that he was already married to me, that should have been impossible in a country where bigamy was a crime. But Richard had not used his real name when he married Eleanor. On these documents he was David Thompson, a businessman from Richmond who traveled frequently for work and could only visit his Virginia wife and family on weekends and holidays. David Thompson had a social security number, a driver's license, credit cards, an entire identity that existed only to support this second life. Richard had created this fictional person 34 years ago and had maintained the deception for more than 3 decades, lying to Eleanor as thoroughly as he had lied to me, making promises to her that he had no intention of building a family with her, that lived in the shadow of his real life, without ever knowing the sun was being blocked by someone else. We sat on her porch for hours that first day, Eleanor and I, drinking iced tea and sharing stories like 2 strangers discovering they had been in a car accident together. She told me about meeting David, as she called him, at a business conference in Washington, D.C. when she was 29 years old and working as an accountant. She told me about the whirlwind courtship, the proposal after only 6 months, the wedding that her parents had been uncertain about because this man seemed to have no family, no roots, no history beyond what he chose to share. She told me about the farm, which David had purchased as a wedding gift, telling her that he wanted them to have a place away from the pressures of his business, a sanctuary where they could build a life together. She told me about their 2 sons, Matthew and Andrew, who had grown up believing their father was a successful businessman named David Thompson, who had accepted his frequent absences as the price of his career, who were now in their late 20s and early 30s with families of their own, still living nearby, still completely unaware that their father had been anyone other than who he claimed to be. And she told me about the moment she knew something was wrong, which had come just 3 days ago when she saw a news article about the death of a prominent Connecticut financial consultant named Richard Morrison, and the photograph accompanying the obituary showed the face of the man she had loved and married and built her life around for over 3 decades. I listened to Eleanor's story and felt something I did not expect to feel. Compassion. Here was a woman who had been deceived just as I had been deceived, who had given her heart to a man who was incapable of honesty, who had raised 2 children believing they were part of a legitimate family, when in fact they were the products of a fraud so elaborate it defied comprehension. Eleanor was not my enemy. She was not the other woman in any meaningful sense. She was another victim, another casualty, of Richard's pathological need to control every aspect of his existence, to have not just one life, but two, not just one family, but two, not just one identity, but as many as he needed to satisfy whatever emptiness drove him to these extraordinary deceptions. When Eleanor told me she had loved David with all her heart, that she still could not reconcile the gentleman she knew with the calculating deceiver he apparently was, I reached across the space between our chairs and took her hand. We sat there in silence for a long moment, two women who had nothing in common except the man who had betrayed them both. And in that silence something shifted. We were no longer strangers. We were not friends, not yet, perhaps never. But we were allies in a battle we had not known we were fighting, united against a ghost who could no longer defend himself or explain his actions. The days that followed were a blur of discovery and revelation. Eleanor showed me around the farm, this hidden paradise that my husband had maintained with money I never knew existed, with time I thought he was spending on business, with love and attention that should have been directed toward the family he already had. The property was worth millions, the result of decades of investment and improvement, of careful stewardship and professional management. There were livestock operations that generated significant income, crop leases that brought in annual payments, timber rights that had been harvested responsibly and replanted systematically. Richard, or David, had built an empire here in secret, a financial fortress that existed completely outside the life he shared with me, protected by trusts and corporations and legal structures designed to keep it hidden from anyone who might come looking. I met Eleanor's sons, Matthew and Andrew, young men who looked at me with confusion and suspicion, who could not understand who I was or why I had come, who were still reeling from the news that their father was not only dead, but had been living under a false identity their entire lives. I saw the life Richard had built here, the horses he raised, the gardens he tended, the community he had become part of, and I understood with devastating clarity that this was not a side project or a passing fancy. This was his true life, the existence he valued, the place where he was most fully himself, the home I had kept for him in Connecticut, the children we had raised together, the marriage I had believed was the center of his world. All of it was secondary to this hidden paradise, where he could be whoever he wanted to be without the constraints of his real identity. Stories like these have the power to change how we see our own lives. If you are finding clarity here, if something in this narrative is helping you understand your own situation better, consider subscribing. Every story I share is chosen to help us all grow stronger, wiser, and more compassionate with ourselves and others. There is wisdom in shared experience, and together we can find the strength to face truths we never wanted to know. I stayed in Virginia for 2 weeks, sleeping in the guest cottage, eating meals with Eleanor, trying to piece together the puzzle of my husband's double existence. We shared information like detectives working a cold case, comparing timelines, matching receipts, correlating absences with visits, building a picture of how Richard had managed to maintain 2 complete families for over 3 decades without either one discovering the other. The logistics alone were staggering. He had maintained 2 phone numbers, 2 email accounts, 2 sets of credit cards, 2 wardrobes, 2 completely separate identities that never overlapped, except in the physical person who moved between them. His business travel, which I had always believed was legitimate, was in fact a cover for his visits to Virginia, carefully scheduled to coincide with times when Eleanor expected David to be home. His late nights at the office, which I had attributed to dedication and hard work, were often phone calls to his other family, conversations that took place behind closed doors while I sat downstairs watching television, never suspecting that my husband was speaking to another woman who believed she was his wife. The deception was so complete, so meticulous, so perfectly executed that I found myself almost admiring it, even as I was devastated by it. Richard had been a brilliant man. There was no denying that. He had built a successful business, raised 2 families, maintained 2 complete lives, and died without either one knowing the truth about the other. If not for those photographs, those damning images hidden in a secret compartment, his secret might have died with him. Instead, here I was, sorting through the wreckage, trying to understand how someone I had loved could have been capable of such sustained and deliberate cruelty. The lawyers came next. There were many lawyers, it turned out, because Richard's estates, plural, were complicated by the dual identities he had maintained. His will, the one our family attorney had on file, left everything to me and our children, as I had expected. But there was another will, one held by a Virginia attorney, leaving the farm and all associated assets to Eleanor and her sons, bequeathing them the life David Thompson had built with them over 3 decades. The legal battles that ensued were ugly and protracted, with Jennifer and Thomas demanding that the Virginia properties be included in Richard's legitimate estate, arguing that Eleanor had no legal claim because her marriage was invalid, because David Thompson was a fiction, because everything built on that foundation was therefore fraudulent. Eleanor and her sons argued that they had been innocent victims of Richard's deception, that they had invested their lives in the farm believing it was legitimately theirs, that they should not be punished for crimes committed against them. I found myself caught in the middle, sympathizing with Eleanor even as my own children demanded I fight for what they called our rightful inheritance. The situation forced me to choose sides in a war I had not started, to pick a team when I felt like a spectator at my own destruction. And as the lawyers argued and the documents flew and the accusations mounted, I began to realize that I had a decision to make, not about money or property or legal technicalities, but about who I wanted to be in the aftermath of this catastrophe. Jennifer came to Virginia on the 2nd week of my stay, arriving unannounced, furious at my extended absence and suspicious about what I was doing in a state I had never shown any interest in visiting. When she saw the farm, when she met Eleanor, when she understood the scope of her father's betrayal, her reaction was exactly what I had feared. She did not see victims on either side. She saw only competition, rivals for the wealth that she believed rightfully belonged to our family. She demanded that I stop fraternizing with the enemy, that I return home immediately, that I let the lawyers handle everything while I maintained appropriate distance from these people who had stolen so much of her father's time and money. She looked at Matthew and Andrew, her half-brothers, though she would never acknowledge them as such, with contempt that bordered on hatred, as if they were personally responsible for Richard's choices, as if they had somehow orchestrated their own conception and upbringing as part of an elaborate scheme to defraud her of her inheritance. I listened to my daughter's tirade with growing disillusionment, recognizing in her the worst qualities of her father, the sense of entitlement, the inability to see others as fully human, the absolute certainty that she was owed everything she wanted simply because she wanted it. And when she finished, when she stood before me with her hands on her hips, demanding that I choose her side, I said something that surprised us both. I said no. I said that I was tired of choosing sides, tired of fighting battles that served no one's interests except those who profited from conflict. I said that Eleanor and her sons were not our enemies, that they were casualties of the same war that had wounded us, that the only person who deserved our anger was dead and beyond the reach of any revenge we might imagine. Jennifer stared at me as if I had grown a second head. She accused me of betraying the family, of being senile, of being manipulated by these strangers who had clearly brainwashed me during my weeks away. And then she left, returning to Connecticut in a fury, swearing to fight with or without my support, to claim every penny that was rightfully hers regardless of who got hurt in the process. The months that followed were the most difficult of my life. The legal proceedings dragged on, complicated by questions of fraud and identity and the validity of transactions conducted under a false name. Jennifer and Thomas hired aggressive attorneys who challenged every aspect of Eleanor's claim, painting her as a willing accomplice in Richard's deception, despite all evidence to the contrary. Eleanor's lawyers responded in kind, questioning my knowledge of my husband's activities, suggesting that I must have known something about his double life, implying that my ignorance was either feigned or willful. I found myself under attack from all sides, distrusted by my own children for my refusal to condemn Eleanor, suspected by Eleanor's legal team of hiding information that might harm their case. The stress was overwhelming, the sleepless nights endless, the sense of isolation nearly unbearable. I had lost my husband, my certainty about my past, my relationship with my children, and now I was losing myself, disappearing into the chaos of competing claims and accusations that swirled around me like a storm that would never end. If you have been in a situation where everyone wanted something from you, where you felt torn between impossible choices, where loyalty itself became a trap, then what I am about to tell you will resonate. Sometimes the path forward requires us to abandon everything we thought we knew about ourselves, to become someone new in order to survive the destruction of who we were. I found that path, though it took me longer than I would have liked, and what I discovered on the other side was worth every moment of pain it took to get there. It was 8 months after Richard's death when I finally understood what I needed to do. I was sitting in yet another lawyer's office, listening to yet another argument about asset distribution and estate valuation, when I suddenly could not bear it anymore. I stood up in the middle of a sentence, walked out of the room, drove to the farm in Virginia, and sat on Eleanor's porch as the sun set over the rolling hills. Eleanor found me there an hour later, brought me a glass of wine, and sat beside me in the comfortable silence that had grown between us over the months of our strange acquaintance. And I told her something I had been thinking about for weeks, but had not yet found the courage to say. I told her I was done fighting. I told her that the money, the property, the assets that everyone was battling over meant nothing to me, that I would rather walk away with nothing than spend another day in courtrooms and conference rooms arguing about the spoils of a life that had been a lie. I told her that I had enough to live on, that Richard's retirement accounts and life insurance were untouched by the legal disputes, that I could be comfortable without a single penny from the contested estates. And I told her that I wanted her to have the farm, that I would instruct my lawyers to drop all claims to the Virginia properties, that Matthew and Andrew deserved to keep the home they had grown up in, the legacy their father, whoever he really was, had built for them. Eleanor was silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Then she reached over and took my hand, the same gesture I had made on my first day here, and she said something that I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Patricia, you are the only good thing that came out of Richard's life." I did not know how to respond to that. I still do not. The aftermath of my decision was predictable in some ways, surprising in others. Jennifer and Thomas were furious, of course, convinced that I had lost my mind, threatening legal action to have me declared incompetent, swearing that they would never forgive me for giving away their inheritance. Thomas eventually calmed down, accepted my decision with the reluctant grace he had inherited from my side of the family, and gradually resumed speaking to me, though our relationship was never the same. Jennifer cut me off completely, refusing my calls, returning my letters unopened, telling the grandchildren that Grandma was not well and should not be contacted. The loss of my daughter was the hardest part, harder than losing Richard, harder than discovering the truth, harder than walking away from the money that could have made my remaining years extremely comfortable. But I found that I could bear it, that the peace I had gained by stepping out of the conflict was worth the price I paid in family relationships. I had spent my entire adult life trying to keep everyone happy, sacrificing my own needs and desires on the altar of family harmony. Now, for the first time, I was choosing my own path, making decisions based on what I believed was right rather than what others expected of me, and the freedom that came with that choice was intoxicating, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. I sold the house in Connecticut, the beautiful colonial where I had raised my children and believed I was happy. I gave Jennifer and Thomas their father's personal effects, the watches and cufflinks and golf clubs that connected them to the man they remembered, the legitimate version of Richard Morrison, who had been their devoted father even while he was deceiving all of us. And then I did something that would have been unthinkable to the woman I was before Richard's death. I moved to Virginia, not to the farm, that was Eleanor's domain and would remain so, but to a small cottage in the nearby town, a charming 2-bedroom house with a garden and a view of the mountains, where I could start fresh, build a new life, become someone other than Richard Morrison's widow. Eleanor and I became friends, real friends, the kind who have lunch together weekly and call each other when something interesting happens. Her sons accepted me gradually, cautiously, still unsure how to relate to this woman who was simultaneously a victim of their father's deception and a reminder of the family they had unknowingly competed with their entire lives. I became a regular presence at family gatherings, the strange aunt who appeared from nowhere, whose relationship to everyone else defied easy explanation, but who belonged nonetheless. And in that belonging, in that acceptance by people who had every reason to reject me, I found something I had not known I was missing. I found myself. I am 68 now, a year older than I was when Richard died and my world collapsed. I spend my mornings in my garden, my afternoons reading or taking long walks through the Virginia countryside, my evenings sometimes alone and sometimes with the unlikely family I have assembled from the wreckage of my husband's lies. I do not have the wealth I once enjoyed, the designer clothes and expensive jewelry and vacations in exotic locations, but I have something more valuable, something that all of Richard's money could never have purchased. I have peace. I have authenticity. I have relationships built on truth rather than deception, on mutual respect rather than obligation, on genuine affection rather than the performance of happiness. I think about Richard sometimes, about the man who divided himself between two worlds and belonged fully to neither. I wonder if he was happy, if his double life brought him satisfaction, if the elaborate deceptions were thrilling or exhausting or both. I wonder if he loved me, really loved me, or if I was just a convenient piece of his Connecticut persona, a prop in the performance he was staging for an audience that did not know it was watching a play. I do not have answers to these questions and probably never will. Richard took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only the evidence of his deceptions and two families struggling to make sense of what he had done. But I have made my peace with the mystery, have accepted that some questions cannot be answered, that sometimes the best we can do is build something new from the rubble of what has been destroyed. If these stories are giving you hope, showing you that transformation is possible even after the worst betrayals, then stay with me. Subscribe so you never miss a story that might be exactly what you need to hear at exactly the right moment. We are all on this journey together, learning to rise from the ashes of our former lives, becoming who we were always meant to be. To anyone who is in the middle of a revelation like mine, who has just discovered that their life was not what they thought, who is struggling to understand how someone they loved could have deceived them so completely, I want to offer what wisdom I have gained from my experience. First, the pain is real and it is valid. Do not let anyone tell you that you should be over it by now, that you should move on, that you should be grateful for what you still have. You have suffered a profound trauma, a death not just of a person but of a reality you believed in, and that kind of loss takes time to process. Second, the other victims of the deception are not your enemies. This is hard to remember when lawyers are involved and money is at stake, but the people your loved one deceived are suffering too, are trying to make sense of the same incomprehensible betrayal, are human beings who deserve compassion even if you never become friends. Third, you get to decide who you want to be now. The life you had is over, yes, but that means you are free to build something new, to make choices you would never have made before, to become a person you might not recognize but might actually like better than who you were. And finally, peace is possible. It does not come quickly or easily, and it requires letting go of things you might desperately want to hold on to, like anger and resentment and the fantasy of revenge. But it is possible, and it is worth pursuing. And on the other side of the pain is a life that can be good again, different than what you imagined, but good nonetheless. I drove out to the farm yesterday, as I often do now, to have dinner with Eleanor and celebrate her birthday. Her sons were there with their wives and children, the grandchildren Richard never knew playing in the yard where he had played with them when they were small, under an identity that existed only in his imagination. Eleanor served the roast beef that David had always loved, and we toasted his memory with the wine he had chosen for special occasions. And for a moment, it was almost as if he was still with us, the ghost of a man who had been three people, and therefore, in some fundamental way, no one at all. As I drove home that night, the Virginia stars bright above me, I thought about the journey I had been on since that terrible morning when Richard collapsed at our breakfast table. I thought about the woman I was then, so certain of her life, so secure in her understanding of who she was and what her world contained. And I thought about the woman I am now, scarred and wiser, poorer in assets but richer in self-knowledge, finally living a life that belongs to me rather than to the roles I was assigned by others. Richard's death was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But what came after, the discovery and the pain and the transformation, was also, in a strange way, the best. Because it taught me that I was stronger than I knew, more resilient than I had ever been tested, capable of surviving things I would have said were unsurvivable. And it taught me that even at 68, life can still surprise you, can still offer new beginnings, can still unfold in directions you never imagined when you were young and thought you had it all figured out. I am Patricia Ann Morrison, or at least that is the name on my driver's license. But I am also the woman who walked into a mystery and came out the other side holding her own truth in her hands. I am the widow who refused to be defined by her husband's crimes, the mother who lost a daughter to her own integrity, the stranger who became family to people she should have hated but could not bring herself to blame. I am all of these things and more, a collection of stories still being written, a life still in progress despite the years that pile up and the gray that spreads through my hair. And if there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. You are more than what has been done to you. You are more than the lies you believed, the betrayals you suffered, the roles you played in someone else's drama. You are yourself, irreducible and irreplaceable, and no matter what revelations come, no matter what truths emerge from the darkness, that self remains, waiting for you to claim it, ready for you to finally let it shine. That is what Richard's death taught me, there in the ashes of my former life, standing in the ruins of everything I thought I knew. It is the most valuable lesson I have ever learned, and it came at a cost I would not wish on anyone. But it was worth it. God help me, it was worth every devastating moment, because now, at last, I am free.